Gangas, the Chief Technology Community Officer at the Kapor Center, an operating foundation at the intersection of technology and racial justice, providing research and thought leadership, operating programs, supporting strategic partnerships, and investments to increase diversity across the tech ecosystem. We aim to level the playing field in tech. At the Kapor Center, we believe that technology has the power to solve pressing problems and close long-standing racial and social disparities across sectors. And we also know that communities of color have yet to fully benefit from the power of tech and the potential to advance economic mobility and innovation. Evident to this was all the ways in which we saw the pandemic bringing renewed attention to these long-standing and significant disparities, specifically in access to broadband and technology devices that are so critical in this increasingly digital-driven world. Through my work at the Kapor Center of working directly with the community, I saw the massive need and urgency to help connect students and families through city and statewide collectives. And we started here specifically in Oakland. And through partnership work with organizations doing the direct of the work, it was also a personal time of reflection for myself. Given I saw myself reflected in the faces of the students who were disconnected, who were like me, immigrants, non-English speaking, came from single parent households and didn't have somebody to advocate for them. I knew that I could have been that child disconnected out in East Oakland. But fortunately, there are programs and there are collectives that were tackling this directly on. And so I apply these grassroots insights into the work that I do at the Kapor Center. And through co-leading the Oakland Undivided Policy and Community Engagement Group at the city level, I was able to also learn of the possible solutions and also look for ways to advocate at the state level, specifically at the California level. And I proactively continue to help guide some of these largest funding opportunities of our generation in broadband access towards the communities that need it the most. Additionally, I joined the FCC Diversity and Inclusion Working Group focused on providing guidance on digital discrimination and workforce pathways. Centering these working groups on racial, economic, accessibility, geographic equity is critical. The FCC Commissioner Rosenbaum quoted saying, "Your zip code should not determine your access to broadband," which this pandemic has proven is a must-have, just like electricity and water. And I share that because it is very important to acknowledge the discrimination that has happened before the digital divide is even experienced due to past generations of redline practices that resulted in unequal access in housing options for mortgage appraisals, loans, and overall public and private sector investments. And if we fast forward to this present generation, one of the glaring observations is how these discriminatory outcomes are still mirrored into who has access to fast enough, affordable internet access at home. This is how digital redlining is being manifested. Fortunately, as we get more accurate mapping and more policies, we know we can tackle and end this digital redlining now. This is why elected leaders like Representative Yvette Clarke are tackling this issue head on. Representative Clarke's Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 provided momentum on addressing digital redlining as a nation. And this is why it is my honor to introduce Representative Clarke from New York to share the call to action for this generation. Please welcome Representative Clarke.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and I proudly represent New York's 9th Congressional District in Central and South Brooklyn. Before we begin, permit me to thank you all for joining us for this year's Digital Inclusion Summit. You know, today, more than 19 million American households lack reliable broadband. When considering that a significant number of these families live predominantly in Black and Brown communities and are intentionally redlined from broadband access, this already distressing figure becomes more daunting and haunting. Moreover, it becomes a cause for action. Over the past decade, and particularly within recent years, the internet has become an essential means for traversing our modern society. Despite this undeniable truth, internet service providers continue to digitally redline communities of color on the basis of nothing but callous greed and racism, in effect, stripping individuals of equitable access to educational, employment, entrepreneurial opportunities, affordable housing, telehealth, and any number of critical services that are increasingly only available online. This discriminatory practice has already tragic consequences and are not limited to individuals. They extend to our families, their communities, as well as small, diverse enterprises with poor broadband that cannot hope to attract new businesses and residents and or fear competition in the marketplace when their neighbors are equipped with superior broadband options. So let me be clear. Broadband access must be a right, not a privilege, and digital redlining extends racial discrimination from the physical world into an ever-expanding virtual civil society, full stop. That's why I've introduced the Anti-Digital Redlining Act to protect the right in underserved and underrepresented communities nationwide. Simply put, this practice of creating and perpetuating inequities between already marginalized groups, specifically through the purposeful withholding of digital technologies, digital content, and the internet. This cannot and must not continue. My legislation would allow the FCC to investigate discriminatory practices undertaken by internet service providers based on income, race, color, religion, national origin, and other factors within a geographic area and prohibit these service providers from entering exclusive agreements with multi-dwelling units or landlords that would limit competition, consumer choice, or favor any particular provider, as well as much, much more. In other words, the Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 would ensure equitable access to high-quality, affordable broadband coverage in marginalized communities by preventing the practices that create digital redlining. And we must prevent these practices from flourishing because, as we know, broadband is a necessity. Broadband is transformative, and broadband is a right and not a privilege. The Anti-Digital Redlining Act of 2021 is needed to protect that right in underserved and underrepresented communities across our nation. Bridging a digital divide that grows wider with each passing day is no small feat, and my legislation is a very significant piece in this vital effort. It is an essential, crucial, and critical piece. If America still hopes to proclaim itself the land of opportunity, then it is our responsibility to make that a reality for all Americans, however long it takes. So thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, get vaccinated and boosted, and most of all, take good care. Thank you once again.
Hello there, and welcome again to the Digital Inclusion Summit 2022. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai Quartey, National Affairs Contributor to the Grio, guest lecturer at Pepperdine University, Graduate School of Education and Psychology, and the former senior policy advisor, one of the former senior policy advisors to the Biden-Harris campaign. I'm really delighted to be a part of the Digital Inclusion Summit, particularly at this inflection point in our history. So many opportunities in the days ahead, and we're looking forward to talking a little bit about those opportunities. Before I introduce our guests that'll be joining me for this fireside chat, I want to set the table a little bit. And first things first, I want to acknowledge just the leadership of Representative Yvette Clarke of New York. I want to recognize her and her incredible staff for the work that they've done in advancing the anti-digital redlining proposal that was included in the infrastructure package that passed Congress and was signed into law by President Biden. That proposal, those set of proposals really represent a giant step forward for folks that have been working on broadband issues and have been working to address digital redlining for some time. In redlining, where have we heard that term before? That's really at the center of this conversation. When we talk about redlining here in the United States, we're talking about the discriminatory practice in which services, financial and otherwise, were withheld from potential customers who resided in neighborhoods classified as hazardous to investment. Those residents largely belong to, that's right, you guessed it, racial and ethnic minorities. And some of the most well-known examples involve denial of credit, of insurance, denial of health care, and the development of food deserts in minority neighborhoods have also attributed to redlining in many instances. That's sort of the brick and mortar version of redlining. We're going to talk about digital redlining today. We're going to talk about what that is, how it started, and the legacy that we have to contend with. And to go deeper on that, right now I want to introduce Vinhcent Lai, the Senior Legal Counsel for Technology and Equity at the Greenlining Institute in my home state of California. Vinhcent, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And so, first things first, tell us, what is digital redlining and how does it affect important aspects of our everyday lives?
Right. So, redlining in the past was redlining on the basis of, race and ethnicity and lack of access to services. So digital redlining is just the modern version of that, in particular focusing on when internet service providers build out their broadband networks in high income areas, while lower income neighborhoods are left with slower or more expensive options or no options at all. And that impacts a lot, right? So when you have more expensive or slower internet, you have lower adoption, right? Less people sign up for the internet, and there's higher prices because of less competition and investment due to redlining. So without that access, you have lower digital literacy skills, and then that means you have a lower ability to get good jobs. And wage growth is highest in jobs that have high digital literacy skills. And this access and skills gap is in large part due to lack of access to the internet. And in particular today, right, 42% of U.S. workers were working from home nearly full time, right? So internet access is key for employment outcomes. Academically, if you have internet access, you're 6 to 8% more likely to graduate high school. Classes today during the pandemic all require online access to just do your homework or even log in to watch your teacher lecture. And finally, you get 10 to 20% higher math, science, and reading scores. So that's why Greenlining focuses so much on this digital redlining issue, because digital redlining denies access to economic opportunity, just like redlining in the past denied access to home buying and other forms of wealth building.
And Vinhcent, can you talk a little bit about what some of the structural underpinnings of digital redlining are? I've read about and I've heard a number of scholars and practitioners alike talk about the role that algorithmic bias, for example, plays in enabling digital redlining. Can you talk a little bit about the structural underpinnings of this practice?
Yeah, so I think we need to start back in the past, right? The 1940s when redlining happened, right? That in those times, there were rules created by the government, insurers, banks, that said certain neighborhoods were hazardous, like you said. And that meant the lack of access to investment. The practice of redlining ended in the 1970s with the passage, of anti-discrimination laws. But the impact of that was a massive racial wealth gap, where white families had on average 10 times the wealth of Black ones, and a gap that's only growing. And that's because those neighborhoods that were redlined didn't have access to loans, mortgages, home ownership, education, the key building blocks to economic opportunity. Now take that today, right? Redlining on the basis of race is illegal. But what businesses do, they make investment decisions based on income now. They have algorithms, they have a lot of different data crunching methods to determine where they want to invest. And it just so happens the neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous in the past are unprofitable or not worth investing in today. And that's because of that racial wealth gap caused by redlining. So, I think the structural underpinnings is because of that historical practice. And what happened is redlining just shifted form from discrimination based on race or ethnicity to discrimination based on income.
And I think the natural next question is, how do we fix this problem? you heard me at the top of this conversation give a shout out to Representative Clarke and her team around, some of the work that they've done in terms of advancing anti-digital redlining proposals, the proposal that was a part of the infrastructure package, very high level. Can you share with us sort of what was in that anti-digital redlining package that made it through Congress and was signed by the president? What was in that? And how might some of the proposals in that package help to fix the problem? And what else can we do to fix the problem?
Yeah, actually, that package was kind of like a wish list for a lot of us in the the consumer side of this issue, right? We have the Affordable Connectivity Program, Emergency Broadband Benefit, which tackled one of the major parts of the digital redlining and the internet adoption problem by providing lower cost access to the internet, right? Affordability was the big problem. So we did that with the EBB and the ACP programs. And then we also had a lot more investment in areas that are unprofitable, right? There's not enough competition. So there's more money available to build out the internet. And then finally, we have the digital redlining investigation. I think it's really important that we begin to get good data and investigate which neighborhoods have been redlined by these practices, right? And then when we find that out, we can begin to direct a lot of funding to kind of close that investment gap to incentivize internet service providers to build there, to make sure people get fast internet and they can access the economic opportunity there. But I think we're in the early stages. This is going to take time to implement. And we have to make sure that there's a lot of rulemakings going on right now to implement those rules and making sure that all that funding and those services that we were created go to the right places.
And are there any sort of new support structures that are needed that we need to put in place to extend digital opportunity to everyone? I mean, if we were practicing radical imagination, what could we do? You mentioned that the proposal that Representative Clarke and others have championed, consists of a wish list of items from consumer advocates like yourself. But what didn't make it on to that list that would be a demonstration of radical imagination in terms of solving digital redlining?
Yeah, I think the major missing piece right now is the outreach part, right? We have all of these new programs. We have ways for families to get devices, internet access that they can afford, but people don't know about it, right? There was a survey by AT&T saying, 55% of those that were surveyed didn't even know about that program, the Affordable Connectivity Program. 2/3 of households in California that are eligible haven't signed up. So there needs to be a more targeted focus on outreach. And I think that is very hard, right? I think what we need to do is work with trusted messengers within communities, right? Community organizations that folks can go to and learn about this program, can help people sign up, and then actually begin to take advantage of all of these new programs that are available. So I would like to see, in the grant funding available to provide grants to community organizations to get the word out to the folks that need it.
So speaking of what you'd like to see, what do you hope to see included in the FCC's report?
Yeah, so I think I love the data. I'm really excited to see where they go. I would like to see the demographic and racial breakdowns of which communities have access to high-speed internet and investments. I want to compare outcomes in communities that have good access to broadband and those that don't. We can look at a wide variety of economic indicators, economic growth, academic outcomes to see what tie there is to this digital redlining and the health and wealth of these communities. I think that can help us create the pressure to finally solve this problem and get the connectivity that we need. And then I also want to look at competition, right? I think that's the biggest part of what drives prices down and what gets more investment. So we need to see which communities have more choice and what we can do to build that competition. And then finally, I want a comparison of all the industry players. Who's a good actor, who's willing to invest in communities that may not be as profitable, but are just as important, right? That we want to build up, and who hasn't been doing that, right? So I think naming and shaming at some level is important, at least on the consumer side, to make sure that our internet service providers are, doing what they should be.
That's great. Those are all really great opportunities for us to move this issue forward. In recent years, we've seen so many examples of leaders in a number of different industries, the banking industry, the tech industry, among others, that find their way onto the Hill. They're invited on the Hill to testify, before members of Congress, for example. Sometimes the banter that we hear between members and these private sector leaders, sometimes it feels like it's missing the mark a little bit. It's falling short of that radical imagination that I spoke of earlier. What types of questions do you think that the federal government should be asking themselves and should be asking private industry? Yeah,
I'll start with private industry. I think, we need to be outraged that a lot of, in areas that happen to be low income, disproportionately people of color, they're charging the same price for old, slow internet as they are in wealthier, whiter areas that have faster internet, right? So I want to know, how do you justify that profiteering, off the backs of communities of color with substandard service for years, and you have no investment while you spend all that money in wealthier neighborhoods? So I want to know why and how they justify that, right? I think another question is, with these subsidy programs that are out there, we're giving internet service providers money to build networks. We're giving consumers money to purchase the services from the private industry. So, what incentive is there for them to lower their prices or to provide good services if we keep doing this, right? What do we need to do to make sure that you are good corporate citizens, you're not abusing all this funding that is going to you, to make sure that people have access to, what is a utility, a critical service in our 21st century life. And then for the federal government, I think the question is, is this a permanent program, the Affordable Connectivity Program? And if so, right, how do we make sure that we have the rules out there to make sure that these internet service providers are being good corporate citizens? They're not digitally redlining. They're investing in the communities that need it the most. So, those are the type of questions I would want to ask. Yeah.
Well, we have a pretty broad audience of folks that are watching this session right now. There's some folks who work in tech policy, folks that are digital natives and may not be as much of digital natives as others. I want to ask you this last question before we bring this to a close. Tell us something that we don't know. Are there any trends that you see on the horizon? Are there any insights, that, may not get the attention that it's deserved in the headlines? Tell us something that we don't know about the future of digital redlining in the United States.
I think I'm gonna give it kind of a pitch for the work that we're doing, right? I think what we don't know is that you can't just throw money at this broadband problem, right? And that's kind of what's happened. And I think it's very welcome, but it is going to require a very community, local focus to make sure that these funds go to where they want. And that means recruiting people that aren't normally in the digital space, right? We're working on a program called the Town Link. We're working with food banks, churches, reentry centers, homeless populations, community organizations that don't do any broadband work. And then we're teaching them about all of these new programs that are available. And then they are going to people that they trust to provide that information. And that's what we need to do, right? So I think we need to make sure that at the federal level, these policy changes translate to the local community level to get to the people that don't have access to the internet.
Well, I want to thank you again. A big thank you to Vinhcent Lay, Senior Legal Counsel for Technology Equity at the Greenlining Institute. I really want to thank you for really helping to illuminate some of the challenges, but more importantly, some of the opportunities ahead in terms of expanding broadband access and really addressing the issue of digital redlining head on. The stakes couldn't be higher. Stakes couldn't be higher. You mentioned earlier, the impacts of not having an internet or having access to the internet couldn't be more stark. We've seen it throughout this pandemic. With all of the millions of new jobs that have been created just in the past year or so, not having access to the internet means, less preparation for those jobs. It means, less digital skills. It means, having, potentially a negative effect on academic performance and so forth. And so thank you for making it plain, Vinhcent Lay. We appreciate you. And we appreciate all of the work of, again, Representative Clarke and so many others that have been instrumental in advancing this agenda. You are attending the Digital Inclusion Summit for 2022. The future is digital, voices are diverse, and the impact is personal.
My parents came to the US from Ethiopia. They would work 2 or 3 jobs each because they want to build a better life for me and my brother. They would always tell me when I was a kid, make sure you're studying, you're going to graduate college.
Education is important to us because the more education, the more you grow.
We want them to be better than us.
My name is Kareem and I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. It was tough at first to try and figure out what I want to do for my career. So once I got into UNC Charlotte, I majored in management information systems because it was pretty broad and you had a couple options. I graduated December 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. It was definitely a rough time. It was months where I applied to hundreds of jobs, but I wasn't getting any calls back. On top of everything, I worked for a large electronic retailer part-time, but I got furloughed from that. So I really wasn't making any money. I kind of just felt stuck. You're like, okay, do I have to go back to get my master's? I'm like, what else do I need to do? I was trying to figure that out. I followed basketball statistics and I would always see percentages and trends in different players. And it always revolved around data. I just didn't know how to use it or work with it. So I started looking at different programs, different certifications, maybe going to like a boot camp or something. I stumbled onto a YouTuber named Alex the Analyst. He introduced me to the Google Data Analytics Certificate program. And I knew that this was something that I had to take in order to break that barrier. I put all my time and all my effort into the program.
How to use the SMART framework while creating your questions?
I learned coding with R, SQL, making graphs with data. And it felt really beginner friendly, where you can start this course not knowing anything about data analytics, and you can end feeling real comfortable about getting a job. After graduating from the Google program, it took me about a month to land a job at Infosys. Now I'm making salary and I'm really enjoying getting to collaborate with my colleagues, trying to solve complex problems with the data points that we've got and being out of my parents' crib.
I am so proud of Kareem. Opportunity is here in America. If you want to be, you can be.